The divorce papers he found in a dead woman's drawer changed everything. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Eli Harrow finally opened the drawer. He hadn't meant to. He'd been looking for Margaret's sewing kit the neighbor woman had offered to mend his winter coat, the one with the torn lining he'd been ignoring since October, and he'd told her he thought Margaret kept needles somewhere in the bedroom dresser. So he'd pulled open the bottom drawer, the one he hadn't touched since the funeral, the one that still smelled faintly of lavender, because Margaret had tucked sachets in every corner of everything she owned, and there it was. A folded piece of paper, legal paper, the kind with the fine blue lines, and the official heading stamped at the top. Petition for dissolution of marriage, filed in the county of Harlan, state of Montana. Petitioner Margaret Ann Harrow. Eli stood in the bedroom doorway for a long time with the paper in his hands, and the rain hammering against the window, and the smell of lavender threading through everything like a question he'd never thought to ask. She had been preparing to leave him. Not the accident, not the pond. Those had come after 3 weeks after the date on this paper, according to the timestamp in the corner. 3 weeks after she'd walked into the county clerk's office and started the process of ending their marriage. 3 weeks after she'd decided quietly and alone, and without telling him a single word, that she was done. He stood there until his legs gave out, and he sat down, hard, on the edge of the bed, the paper crumpling slightly in his grip, and outside, the rain kept falling, and the cattle lowed somewhere in the distance, and the house breathed around him with its familiar creaks and silences. 4 years. 4 years he'd been carrying the weight of that afternoon. The argument, the slammed door, the long angry walk across the north pasture while he told himself he needed to cool down. She needed to cool down. They'd talk it through when the heat went out of it. 4 years he'd been living with the image of Ruth Henley riding up on her horse with her face like a closed fist, the way she'd said his name before she said anything else, the way he'd known before she finished the sentence. 4 years of believing the story he'd told himself. I didn't know. I couldn't have known. I left to cool down, not to abandon her. It was an accident. She was alone because of bad timing, not because I drove her there. The paper in his hand suggested a different story. She had been planning her escape, and he hadn't even noticed. Eli set the paper on the nightstand, smoothed it flat with the palm of his hand, and sat with it for a long time. The rain eased toward evening. The cattle quieted. He didn't eat supper, didn't light the lamp, just sat in the growing dark, with the knowledge of what he didn't know about his own marriage, and when the dark was complete, he finally stood. Walked out to the small rise behind the house where he'd buried her, not in town, not in the churchyard, because he couldn't bear the idea of her being that far away, and stood at the foot of her grave without speaking. He'd done this many times over 4 years, stood here in all weathers with nothing to say and no way to leave. Tonight felt different. Tonight he was standing here as a man who didn't understand what had happened, and that was a lonelier position than grief. He went back inside. He made coffee, and at the kitchen table in the small hours of the morning, he opened the drawer where he kept the household papers, and found under the tax records and the deed and the letters from his brother in Wyoming, the letter he'd written to the Homestead Placement Bureau in Helena. He didn't remember writing it. He remembered the night roughly the way you remember nights spent in a particular quality of despair, not the specific details, but the emotional weather of it. It had been late autumn, almost a year after Margaret died, and the house had been so quiet, it had started to feel like a physical pressure against his eardrums. He'd drunk too much of the good whiskey and written a letter asking for a housekeeper, someone to help with the house and the cooking and the smaller repairs, room and board and wages offered. He'd signed it with his name and address and mailed it the next morning before he could think better of it. That had been almost a year ago. He'd received no reply and assumed the bureau had lost it or filed it somewhere and forgotten about it, or simply decided that a widower rancher in the middle of nowhere wasn't a compelling placement opportunity. He'd been relieved, if he was honest. He'd been embarrassed by the loneliness that had produced the letter, embarrassed by the need it represented, and the silence of the bureau had let him pretend the letter had never existed. He folded it back up now and put it away. Tomorrow he had to ride out to check the north fence line. A section had been reported damaged by the early snow, and if he didn't get to it before the next storm, the cattle would drift, and he'd spend a week collecting them from the neighboring properties. It was a 2-day ride out and back. He'd bring the bedroll and camp at the line shack. He went to bed. He lay in the dark with the divorce papers on the nightstand and the sound of Wonron starting up again, and slept eventually the shallow, uncomfortable sleep of a man whose understanding of his own life had just shifted several degrees in a direction he wasn't prepared for. He was gone for 4 days. The north fence was worse than reported, not just the one section, but 3 a long diagonal run of collapsed posts and tangled wire that looked like something had come through in a straight line, possibly a small stampede or a very determined elk. He worked through 2 cold days, fixing it, sleeping rough at the line shack, eating what he'd packed, and trying not to think about divorce papers and lavender sachets and the particular loneliness of learning things too late. By the time he turned back toward home, he was running on empty, short on sleep, low on water, after his canteen had developed a leak, and moving through the particular exhaustion that comes not just from the body, but from the mind, that won't stop working even when there's nothing productive left to work through. The gelding smelled something at the 2-mile mark. Eli noticed it the way you notice a change in a familiar sound, not suddenly but gradually, the awareness rising from somewhere below conscious thought. The horse's ears were forward, his nostrils working. Some shift in the wind from the direction of the ranch house. Eli straightened in the saddle, despite the ache in his lower back, squinted toward the tree line through the late afternoon haze. Smoke, thin and gray, rising from his chimney in a steady column against the pale sky. Eli hadn't lit that stove since early fall. He lived cold in the winters, mostly building fires, only when the temperature dropped below what his body could tolerate, and even then only in the front room. The kitchen stove required wood he didn't always bother to split. He'd been eating cold food and drinking cold coffee and telling himself it didn't matter. He reached for the rifle in the saddle scabbard by instinct, his hand closing around the stock before he'd consciously decided to do it. Then he rode forward at a steady pace, watching the smoke, watching the fence line, watching for anything else that was different. The gate to the south pasture stood open. Eli never left that gate open. It was one of the rituals that held the shape of his days together. Close the gate latch, it'd check the latch. He rode through it now and felt the wrongness of it like a stone in his boot. The porch had been swept. He stopped the horse 40 feet out and stared at his own front steps. 3 years' worth of leaves and debris and general neglect gone. The boards were clean in the fading afternoon light, and there beside the door, in the spot where Margaret had always kept her planters, a clay pot with something green growing in it. Not flowering yet, but tended, watered. Through the window lamplight, a moving shadow, human-shaped, deliberate, unhurried. Someone was in his house, and whoever it was had been there long enough to sweep the porch and plant something in a pot and light the lamp as the afternoon darkened, doing all of this with the ease of someone who felt they had a right to be there. Eli dismounted, tied the horse to the rail, stood for a long moment in the cooling air rifle at his side, breathing carefully. His first thought was practical. Someone had seen the place from the road and decided it looked abandoned. It happened a house with no smoke from the chimney, no evidence of regular habitation, sitting back from the road behind a screen of cottonwoods. Travelers sometimes helped themselves to empty-looking structures. He'd found a family of squatters in the old Pierce homestead once 3 counties over, and they'd looked at him with genuine shock when he explained whose property it was. But squatters didn't sweep porches, and they didn't plant flowers. He moved toward the door. His boots were quiet on the clean boards. He could hear sounds from inside now. The soft scrape of a spoon against cast iron, the muted clank of a lid being set aside. Cooking sounds. The sounds of a kitchen in use, which this kitchen hadn't been in any meaningful way for a long time. The door wasn't locked. He pushed it open. The warmth hit him. First real warmth, not just the absence of cold, but actual heat, the kind that meant a fire had been burning for hours, and the walls had finally absorbed enough of it to give it back. The air smelled of beans, and something cornbread adjacent, and coffee rich and dark. And for one disorienting moment, Eli was not in his present life at all, but in some other version of it. Some version where the kitchen was always warm, and something was always cooking, and he wasn't alone. Then his eyes adjusted, and he raised the rifle, and saw her. She stood at his stove with her back to him, stirring whatever was in the pot, with the focused attention of someone who didn't intend to burn it. Medium height, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, a plain cotton dress, some blue-gray color, and an apron tied over it. His apron the one that had been hanging on the hook since Margaret left it there. Her arms were bare to the elbow, and tanned and capable-looking the arms of someone accustomed to actual work. She didn't turn around. She didn't flinch at the sound of the door or the weight of his presence in the room. She just kept stirring. "You can put that rifle down," she said. Her voice was steady as a fence post, not loud, not performing calm, but actually calm the way people are calm when they've thought through the scenario in advance and decided on their response. "I'm not armed, and I'm not a threat. I just need to talk to you before you make any decisions." "Turn around," Eli said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by 4 days of cold air and too little water. She turned around. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-30s, maybe, though she had one of those faces that was hard to pin down, the kind that had been lived in hard enough to make the usual markers unreliable. Strong bones, a straight nose, eyes the color of a sky before rain gray with something darker underneath. Not pretty in the conventional sense, but striking in the way that honest things are striking, no artifice, nothing softened or performed. She looked at him the way you'd look at a horse that was on the edge of spooking, steady patient, giving it room to settle. "My name is Nora Calloway," she said. "Are you Eli Harrow?" "You know who I am," he said. "You're in my house." "I know who you are because of this." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a folded piece of paper, extending it toward him across the kitchen. He didn't move to take it, so she set it on the table. "You wrote to the Homestead Placement Bureau in Helena about 14 months ago. They sent me your address 3 weeks ago. It took me this long to get here." Eli lowered the rifle an inch. He stared at the paper on the table. "The Bureau," he said. "The Bureau," she confirmed, and turned back to her pot. He crossed the kitchen slowly and picked up the paper, his handwriting messy, slanting the way it always did when he was tired, or had been drinking, several words crossed out and rewritten. He remembered writing it the way you remember a dream in outline rather than detail the emotional texture of it, preserved even as the specifics dissolved. The loneliness of that night, the way the silence had accumulated until it was louder than noise. The whiskey. The decision made in some dark corner of himself to reach out to the impersonal machinery of a placement bureau because he couldn't bring himself to ask anyone he knew. "That was over a year ago," he said. "Letters get delayed," Nora said, "especially when they pass through 3 different offices. The bureau sent me your file 6 weeks ago, but I couldn't leave immediately." She paused, seemed to weigh something, then said simply, "There were arrangements to be made." "What arrangements?" That falls under the category of things we don't need to discuss right now. She ladled beans onto a plate without asking whether he wanted any. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. Sit down. This is my house, Eli said. I know it is. She set the plate on the table and looked at him steadily. Sit down, Mr. Harrow. He sat down. He wasn't entirely sure why, except that his body was making decisions independently of whatever his mind was still trying to work through, and his body wanted to sit down, wanted to eat something hot, wanted the warmth of the stove that was making the kitchen almost comfortable for the first time in years. I asked for a housekeeper, he said, looking at the plate. The beans smelled extraordinary, which probably said more about his current state than about the cooking. I wasn't expecting. He gestured vaguely. Someone your age. My age, she repeated, not quite a question. I assumed the bureau would send someone older. A widow, maybe. I am a widow, Nora said, and sat down across from him with her own plate. And I'm 34, which is old enough to know how to do the work, and young enough to actually do it. She met his eyes. Is there a problem with my age, Mr. Harrow? He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and ate. The beans were very good. He didn't say so. He ate half the plate before he spoke again. You came a long way for a housekeeper position. I came a long way for a new start. She said the same phrasing he would come to recognize as Nora's specific form of honesty. The answer that was true, without being the whole truth. Same as anybody heading west. Your letter offered fair wages and a place to stay. I took it. You let yourself into my house. The door was unlocked. She said it without apology. I'd been here for 2 days by the time you got back. I needed to eat and sleep, and your larder has enough to cover both. 2 days. He set down his fork. You've been in my house for 2 days. I swept the porch, she offered, and I repaired the hinge on the kitchen cabinet, the one on the left. It was hanging crooked. She looked at him with those rain-gray eyes. I figured if you came back and decided you didn't want me here, the work would still be done. Eli pushed his plate aside and looked at her properly for the first time, not with suspicion, but with the assessment that the situation actually required. She'd been here 2 days and had swept the porch and fixed a cabinet hinge and planted something in a pot by the door and cooked a hot meal. She'd waited for him with the composure of someone who had calculated their position and decided it was defensible. She was out of resources. He could see it in the careful way she moved, the too controlled stillness that came from someone who couldn't afford to waste anything, not energy, not words, not the goodwill of the person whose kitchen she'd borrowed. Whatever arrangements she'd had to make before leaving, they'd cost her. She'd arrived here with nothing much left, and the expectation, the hope that it would be enough. He recognized that position. He'd been in it himself 4 years ago, standing at a fresh grave, and understanding that he had to get up and walk back to the house and figure out what came next. 6 months, he said. She looked at him. Trial period, 6 months. You do the workhouse cooking, whatever repairs are within your capability, in exchange for room and board, and $25 a month. At the end of 6 months, we reassess. Agreed, she said immediately. There are rules. He held her gaze. The spare room upstairs is yours. My room is mine. We maintain a professional arrangement. We don't ask each other personal questions about where we came from or why we're here. Something shifted in her expression at that, not quite relief, but close. Agreed. If either of us decides it isn't working, we say so directly. No drama. Understood. And I need you to tell me one thing. He kept his voice even. Is there anything I should know about you coming here? Anything that could cause problems for this property, or for me? The pause was barely perceptible. If he hadn't been watching her closely, he would have missed it. No, she said. Nothing that can find me here. That phrasing, find me, was unusual. He filed it away. All right, he said. The room upstairs is the second door on the right. Linens are in the hall closet. He stood. "I need to put the horse up. Don't wait up." He left her at the table and went back out into the dark to take care of the gelding, and while he unsaddled and brushed and watered and fed, he ran through the conversation in his mind and tried to identify what was bothering him about it. It wasn't her. She'd been direct and competent and calm, and those were qualities he had more respect for than most of what passed for social grace in this part of the world. It wasn't the unconventional arrival the 2 days in his house before he got back the borrowed provisions. It was the pause, the fractional hesitation before nothing that can find me here. The particular phrasing of it, not "no, I have no problems following me," but "nothing that can find me here." A statement about geography rather than about circumstances. Whatever she was running from, she'd run far enough that she believed the distance was protection. He would find out what it was, eventually. People always let their pasts through, eventually, in the way they flinched at certain sounds, in what they talked around, in the particular shape of their silences. He'd learned to read those signs in the years since Margaret, in the long, solitary education of a man who spent more time than was healthy thinking about things. But that was future business. Tonight, he was too tired to think clearly about anything. He latched the barn door and walked back across the dark yard to the house where lamplight showed warm in the kitchen window, and went upstairs to his room and lay down on his bed, fully dressed because he didn't have the energy to do otherwise, and was asleep before he'd finished the thought. He'd started. She was up before him. Eli had spent 20 years of ranch work training his body to rise before dawn, and it still did a kind of internal machinery that ran regardless of how late he'd fallen asleep, or how inadequate the sleep had been. He dressed in the dark, pulled on his boots, and went downstairs expecting the silence he'd grown used to. Instead, coffee smell. Lamplight, low and golden. Nora at the stove with her back to him, her hair already braided, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. 2 cups on the table, steam rising. "I didn't hear you get up," he said. "Old habit." She set a pan of scrambled eggs on the table without turning around. "Sit." He sat and poured coffee and was halfway through it before he noticed the piece of paper she'd set beside the cup. He picked it up. She'd done an inventory of the property. In neat, precise handwriting, the handwriting of someone who'd been taught careful penmanship and had kept the habit, she'd cataloged every repair the ranch needed. Organized by section fences, 5 specific locations, numbered. Barn roof, damage, door hardware. 2 boards rotted at the base of the east wall house. The porch steps, too, had soft spots. Window latch on the north bedroom. The chimney cap that had shifted in the last wind water pump needs packing, losing pressure. Livestock water north trough has a slow leak. She'd estimated materials needed and flagged which items were urgent versus which could wait. "You did this yesterday," Eli said, "after I got supper started." She sat down across from him with her own coffee. "Took about 3 hours to walk the full perimeter. I hope you don't mind." He did mind, slightly minded the evidence of how far things had slid, minds, the inventory of his failures laid out in careful handwriting. But he couldn't fault the work itself. The list was accurate. More accurate than his own mental accounting, which had learned over the years to look past the deterioration the way you learn to look past a scar. Not ignoring it exactly, just ceasing to really see it. "We'll start with the fences," he said. "South pasture first, then work north." "I figured," Nora said. "The tools are already on the porch. I pulled them from the barn this morning." He looked at her across the table. "It's barely light out." "I've been up since 4, she said. "I get restless if I stay still too long." She didn't elaborate on that, and he didn't ask. The rules were the rules, and he'd set them himself. They went out together as the sky was moving from gray to pale gold, and worked through the morning in near silence, Eli driving the posts and Nora stretching the wire. The 2 of them developing the wordless rhythm of people who've done physical work long enough to understand how to work alongside someone else. Reading the other person's pace, adjusting without discussion, passing tools before they're asked for. By noon, they'd covered 300 yards of fence line, and Eli had revised his assessment of her upward from adequate to good. She didn't complain. That was the first thing he noticed. The work was hard in the specific way. Fence repair is hard, low to the ground, twisting the wire, fighting you, the posts requiring all your body weight behind the driver, and by mid-morning her palms were showing the beginning of blisters from the wire stretcher. But she wrapped them with a strip of cloth she produced from her pocket and kept working. She was also faster than he expected. She'd clearly done this before, or something very like it. There was no hesitation in how she handled the tools, no learning curve. She worked like someone revisiting a skill, not acquiring one. "You've done fence work before," he said during the noon break, sitting in the shade of a cottonwood with water and the sandwiches she'd packed that morning. "Some," she said, looking at the wire rather than at him. "Where?" She glanced at him. "That sounds like a personal question, Mr. Harrow." "It's a question about skills," he said. "I need to know what I'm working with." A pause. She seemed to consider the line between the two. "My father was a carpenter," she said finally. "I grew up working alongside him, and the place I came from before, here there was fencing to do." She looked back at the wire. "I'm competent at it. That's what matters." He let it go. She was right. It was what mattered. They finished the south pasture as the sun started toward the horizon and came back to the house tired and dirty and moving with the specific care of people whose muscles had been thoroughly used. He expected her to sit down, or at least to pause. Instead, she went directly to the kitchen and started supper. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said from the doorway. "We can make do with something cold." "I can make do with a hot meal," she said, the same firm tone she'd used the night before. "Go wash up." He washed up. Over supper, chicken and potatoes, the chicken from the coop she'd apparently checked and organized at some point that morning. They sat in silence, the air between them. Not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. The silence of two people learning each other's rhythms. A working silence. He'd forgotten what it was like to share this kind of silence with someone, the silence that was companionable rather than merely empty. Outside the window, the sky deepened from amber to purple to the first pale dark of evening. "The barn roof tomorrow?" he said when he finished. "I saw the soft spots." She stacked the plates without being asked. "We'll need shingles. I counted what's in the storage shed. There's enough for the worst areas, but not the whole roof. I'll ride into town Friday and get more." She nodded. He stood. He almost said something else. The impulse was there, some small social courtesy that the situation seemed to call for, but he let it pass and went upstairs. In his room, he sat on the edge of the bed and listened. Below him, the sounds of the kitchen being cleaned, water poured, dishes moved, the soft drag of a chair being pushed back. Then the lamp being turned down. Then her footsteps on the stairs, quiet and even, and the second door closing. Silence. But a different kind of silence than the house had held for 4 years. Not the silence of absence. The silence of two people separately being still. He lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the divorce paper in the nightstand drawer. He'd been thinking about it for 4 days on the trail and hadn't gotten any closer to knowing what to do with it. There was nothing to do with it. Practically speaking, Margaret was dead. The petition had never been finalized, and it didn't change anything material about his situation. What it changed was internal, and that was harder. He'd believed one story about his marriage for 4 years. Now he had to live with a more complicated one. He thought about what Nora had said, "Nothing that can find me here," and about the pause before it, and about the way she'd moved through the house when she thought he wasn't watching, with a watchfulness of her own, a contained alertness that looked like confidence, but had something else underneath it. The alertness of someone who'd learned to be careful. He thought about the two of them in their separate rooms in this house that had been silent for so long, both of them carrying something they weren't ready to name. The rain started again around midnight, soft at first, and then heavier. Tapping against the window in a rhythm that was almost like company, Eli Harrow lay in the dark and listened to it, and did not sleep for a long time. The second week was better than the first. Not easier exactly, the work was the same, hard and relentless, in the specific way of ranch work in autumn, always one step ahead of the next thing that needed doing. But something about the rhythm of it improved some calibration between the two of them that made the days move differently. He stopped waiting for her to slow down or complain or need instruction. She stopped, and he noticed this, filed it as significant, looking toward the road when she heard hoofbeats in the distance. She did that the first week, a sound from the road, and her head came up and her hand stopped, and she'd hold very still for a beat before returning to whatever she'd been doing. He didn't mention it. The rules didn't allow for it, and something told him it was the wrong thing to press. Ruth Henley came by on a Wednesday. Eli heard her buggy from the barn and came out wiping his hands on a rag to find her already climbing down with a basket covered in a cloth bread, probably since Ruth brought bread the way other people brought excuses, as a means of gaining access to conversations she wanted to have. Ruth was 65, widowed 8 years ago, the kind of woman the county ran on without quite acknowledging, always present at the moments that required managing, always knowing things before other people did, always finding reasons to stop by the ranches where solitary men were not taking adequate care of themselves. She had been a close friend of Margaret's. She saw Nora before she saw Eli. Nora had come around from the garden side of the house with dirt on her hands and her braid half undone from the morning's work, and she stopped when she saw the visitor, and Ruth stopped when she saw her. The two women looked at each other. "This is Nora Calloway," Eli said, coming up behind Ruth. "She's working here as housekeeper." "I gathered," Ruth said pleasantly, and held out her hand. "Ruth Henley. I'm your nearest neighbor. I live about 4 miles east through the Birch Creek Valley." "It's nice to meet you," Nora said. She shook Ruth's hand, and Eli watched Ruth watching her. Watched the older woman doing the same kind of reading he'd been doing all week, the careful inventory that came from long practice with people. They went inside for coffee. Ruth's real purpose was always coffee and conversation. The bread was just the vehicle, and Eli found things to do in the barn that kept him close enough to hear if something was wrong without being close enough to hear what they were saying. He didn't know why he felt that way. He just did. An hour later, Ruth found him in the barn. "She's a good worker," Ruth said without preamble, settling herself on a hay bale with the ease of someone who'd sat on hay bales all her life. "You can see it in her hands. And she cooks well. That bread I smelled baking would make my husband weep if he were alive to smell it." "She's competent," Eli agreed without looking up from the harness he was repairing. "She's more than competent." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She's running from something." He set down the harness. "We all are, Ruth. Some of us more literally than others." She looked at him steadily. "Eli, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without asking me how I know." He waited. "Her husband isn't dead," Ruth said. The words landed in the silence of the barn like stones in water. Eli looked at her. "She told me she was a widow," he said carefully. "She told you she was—" Ruth agreed. "But the way she talks about him, she doesn't say he was Eli. She says he. Present tense, then she catches herself. And she doesn't have the specific kind of grief that widows carry. What she has is the other thing." Ruth folded her hands in her lap. "She's a woman who's left. And whoever she left, she hasn't gotten free of him yet, legally speaking." Eli was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the pause before "nothing that can find me here." He thought about the way she watched the road. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because she's a good woman," Ruth said simply. "And you're a good man. And I've watched you close yourself off in this house for 4 years. And I don't want you to close yourself off from this because you're working with incomplete information." She stood. "That's all I'm saying. What you do with it is your business." She walked out of the barn, and a few minutes later he heard her buggy moving back up the road toward the valley. He picked up the harness and sat with the new information and the old question, what to do with knowledge you weren't supposed to have, and after a while he went back to work and let the question sit unanswered in the back of his mind, where it would stay for the next 2 weeks, patient and quietly insistent. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Nora had come. It was a young rider from the postal depot, apologetic about the distance he'd had to come. The ranch sat off the main route, and letters needed to wait for someone going that direction. He handed Eli a single envelope, tipped his hat, and rode off. Eli stood by the gate, looking at the envelope for a moment, before he saw the return address. It was postmarked from a town called Bitterroot Crossing, 190 miles east. The handwriting on the front was neat and slanted and masculine. The name in the return corner was D. Calloway. He carried it inside without deciding how he felt about it. Nora was at the kitchen table with a needle and thread, mending one of his flannel shirts that had torn at the shoulder seam, and she looked up when he came in, and he set the letter on the table beside her work. She looked at it. The color left her face so fast, he took a step toward her, involuntarily thinking she might faint. She didn't. She steadied herself with the table edge, both palms flat against the wood, and stared at the envelope. "You all right?" he said. She nodded, not speaking. "I'm going to check on the horses," he said, and went back outside. He gave her an hour, spent it actually checking the horses, which didn't need checking, and then the chickens, which were fine, and then the fence latch on the south side that wasn't quite right, which he fixed slowly and methodically, while the light shifted and the day moved toward evening. When he came back inside, Nora was at the stove making supper. Her eyes were red-rimmed dry now, but recently not dry. She moved with the same efficiency she always brought to cooking, but the efficiency was mechanical now, running on muscle memory rather than attention. He sat at the table and watched her, and did not speak. She served supper. They ate. He cleaned his plate. She barely touched hers. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said when it became clear she wasn't going to speak on her own. "I know." She pushed a piece of potato around her plate. "And you don't have to stay here if you don't want to." She looked up at that. "I mean, if the situation has changed," he said. "If there's something pulling you back. I'm not trying to make decisions for you. But if you need to leave, you can leave. No contract I signed with a placement bureau is worth more than a person's right to make their own choices." Nora set down her fork. She looked at him for a long time with those rain-gray eyes, and he sat still under the scrutiny and let her look. "His name is Damon," she said finally. "My husband. He isn't dead." She said it quietly without drama, as if she were identifying a weather condition rather than making a confession. "I left him 8 months ago. I filed for divorce before I left. The case hasn't been heard yet." She folded her hands on the table. "That letter is from him." "What does it say?" "I don't know. I haven't opened it." A pause. "I'm afraid to." Eli reached across the table and picked up the letter which she'd set beside the salt jar at some point during the meal. He held it out to her. "Do you want to open it now or later?" "Later," she said. "Not tonight." He set it back down. "All right." "I told you I was a widow," she said. "I'm sorry for that. I thought it would be simpler." "It would have been," he agreed. "But simpler isn't always better." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "No," she said slowly. "It isn't." She picked up her fork again, ate a few bites, as if reminding herself that eating was necessary, then set it down again. "He isn't a bad man," she said. I need you to understand that. He isn't cruel. He didn't hit me. He isn't the kind of man that the stories are usually about." She was quiet for a moment. "He's just a man who loves by controlling, who thinks that keeping everything in its place, including me, means things are safe, who was so afraid of losing me that he held so tight I couldn't breathe." She looked at her hands. "I stayed for 3 years thinking I could help him learn to hold differently. I couldn't." "Did he know you were leaving?" "I told him when I filed. I thought the legal process would create distance, make it real and official, and he'd accept it." A short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "He didn't. He wrote to every friend I had trying to find out where I'd gone. He sent his brother to my mother's house. He hasn't stopped." She looked toward the window, toward the dark outside it. "I came as far west as I could find work. I thought the distance would hold. And the letter means the distance didn't hold as well as I thought." Eli sat with that. He thought about the particular landscape of a man who doesn't know how to let go, who loves wrong, and knows it, and can't change it, and keeps reaching anyway out of something that might be love, and might be something else entirely. He thought about Margaret's divorce petition in his nightstand. He thought about how people hold on to things and call it love when it's really the fear of emptiness. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Stay," she said without hesitation. "If you'll let me. I want to stay and do the work and see if the distance is enough." "It's your choice," he said. "The room upstairs is still yours." She nodded. They sat in silence for a moment. Then she started clearing the plates, and he helped her, and they did the dishes side by side, with the lamp burning low and the dark pressing against the windows. And when they said good night, it was with the particular quietness of two people who have exchanged real information and don't know yet what to do with it. He lay in his room that night, listening to the house settle, and thought about Dee Calloway, somewhere east of here, tracking his wife across the country with the patience and resources of a man who believed he had a right to. He thought about the letter still sealed on the kitchen table. He thought about the way Nora had said, "Stay not with hope or longing, but with the simple, flat certainty of a decision already made." He got up, walked down the hall, stood for a moment outside her door, not to knock, not to intrude, just because some instinct wanted to verify that the room was occupied, that the second door was closed and not standing open, that nothing had changed. It was closed. He went back to his room. He lay down. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water, and eventually, in the small hours of the morning, he slept. End of Part 1, approximately 800 words. The weight of what we don't say. The letter stayed on the kitchen table for 4 more days. Nora didn't open it, and Eli didn't mention it, and they both moved around it the way you move around furniture that's been in the wrong place long enough that you've stopped bumping into it by habit, by a kind of practiced inattention. It sat beside the salt jar, and then one day it was beside the lamp, and then by the window, migrating by small increments, as if the house itself was trying to find somewhere to put it. On the 5th day, it was gone. Nora didn't say anything about it, and Eli didn't ask. The work continued. The barn roof was worse than the inventory list had suggested. 3 of the main support beams had developed soft spots from years of water damage, and replacing them required taking down a substantial section of the roof before new shingles could go on. It was a 3-day project that turned into 5. Eli and Nora worked in a rhythm that was by now so established it had lost the awkward quality of 2 people learning each other's habits and become simply the way things got done. Tools handed over before they were requested. 1 person on the roof and 1 below, passing materials the lunch break taken at the same moment, without anyone checking the sun's position. Ruth came back on a Thursday. She came without the bread this time, which meant she was here to talk rather than to manage. She found Nora on the roof the barn side this time, replacing the shingles over the grain storage, and stood below, and called up to her, and they had some kind of conversation that Eli, working on the far end of the structure, couldn't quite hear. He heard Nora laugh once, a real laugh, the sound of it carrying in the cool air. He hadn't heard her laugh like that before. When Ruth left, she came and found Eli in the tack room. "She's a good one." Ruth said the same verdict as before, but with something different in her voice now. "You're going to tell me something else I wasn't supposed to know," Eli said. "Probably." Ruth sat down on the wooden stool he kept for the purpose. "I asked her about Damon." He looked up from the saddle he was oiling. "She didn't tell me much more than she'd already told you, I think," Ruth said. "But she told me one thing." She folded her hands in her lap. She said she stayed in that marriage 3 years past when she knew it was over. 3 years of trying to fix herself to fit a shape that didn't fit her. And she said the worst part wasn't of the controlling or the watching or the way he managed everything around her. She paused. She said the worst part was that she understood why he did it. His father did the same to his mother. He grew up thinking that was love, that keeping everything in its place was the same as keeping everything safe. Eli set down the oilcloth. "As she has compassion for him," Ruth said. "That's what makes it hard. She's not running from a monster. She's running from someone she still partly loves, in the way you still love a tree that fell on your house. You understand how it happened. You can even see the beauty in it, and it still crushed everything." She stood, walked to the door, stopped. "I want to tell you something about Margaret," she said, and his whole body went still. He hadn't heard her say Margaret's name since the funeral. "Not tonight," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Ruth turned and looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. "When you're ready," she said, and went out. He sat in the tack room for a long time after that oilcloth in his hands, not moving. Jonas Pruitt showed up on a Tuesday 3.5 weeks into Nora's time at the ranch. He came on foot, which meant his horse was either dead or sold, or lent out, none of which was encouraging about his current circumstances. He was 38 or 40, lean in the specific way of men who ate irregularly with a hat that had seen better decades, and boots that were coming away from their soles on one side. He'd worked for Eli 2 seasons running 2 and 3 years ago before a combination of restlessness and a gambling problem had sent him drifting. He was good with horses and better with silence, and Eli had been sorry to lose him in the limited way that Eli let himself be sorry about things. He showed up at the south pasture gate on a morning when Nora was in the kitchen making bread, and Eli was mending the last section of the east fence. "Eli," he said. "Jonas." Eli straightened. "You look like hell. Had a rough season." He held his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, and didn't quite meet Eli's eyes. "Looking for work. Figured you might have something." The normal answer was yes, Eli always had something, and Jonas was capable when he was steady. But something in his face wasn't right. A kind of watchfulness under the asking a quality Eli had learned to read from his time working range, alongside men who had more history than they let on. "I'm set for the season," Eli said. "Maybe next spring." Jonas's face went through something relief, almost mixed with the other thing. "All right." He turned the hat. "Sure." "You need a meal," Eli said. He always offered. It didn't mean anything. "No, thanks." He looked at the fence. "Place looks better than I remember it." "Getting there." "I heard you hired someone." He said it carefully, not looking up. "From out east." "Where'd you hear that? Town?" A pause. "Just heard is all. Figured you might want someone who knew the property." "Like I said, maybe spring." Jonas put his hat back on. He looked at Eli, then direct for the first time since he'd arrived, and something passed behind his eyes that wasn't quite an apology, and wasn't quite a warning. "You're a good man, Eli," he said. "Always treated me straight." "And you me," Eli said, which was only partly true, but this didn't feel like a moment for accounting. Jonas nodded, and walked back up the road toward town, and Eli watched him go with his hands still on the fence wire, and the feeling that the conversation had been about something other than work. That night, through the thin walls of the house, he heard them. Not clearly just the rise and fall of voices, Eli's, and another quieter one that shouldn't have been there. He lay in his room and listened. Eli's voice low and taut. "You promised." The other voice, Jonas, he realized. "I know what I promised. But I need money, Eli. I'm not asking much. Eli. You're not getting it. Not like this. Then maybe I talk to someone who... Get out of my house. A door. Footsteps on the porch. The sound of someone leaving. Nora lay still in the dark and thought about the word promised. About what kind of secret required a promise of silence and money to keep it. About Jonas Pruitt's too careful eyes and the way he'd looked at Eli when he thought Eli wasn't looking. She thought about the question she wasn't allowed to ask. She went back to sleep. But it took a long time. In the mornings, they had fallen into the habit of eating breakfast on the porch. When the weather allowed, the autumn mornings were cold, but clear the sky, that particular shade of blue that only happened in the weeks before the first hard frost, and the mountains to the west were starting to show white at their caps. It was during one of these mornings that Eli spoke without quite meaning to. He'd been thinking about Margaret's papers. He thought about them most mornings the way you return to a worry, not because you're going to do anything about it, but because the mind goes to it anyway, the way the tongue goes to a sore tooth. "My wife left a document," he said to the mountains rather than to Nora. "A legal document. I found it after she died." Nora was quiet. She didn't move, didn't look at him, just waited. "She'd been planning to leave," he said. "Filed a petition 3 weeks before she died. I didn't know. I'd thought..." He stopped. "I'd had a version of our marriage in my head. The document changed the version." "How?" Nora asked very quietly. "I'd been telling myself that the last time I saw her we were arguing, but we'd have worked it out. That's what I told myself. But if she'd already filed..." He stopped again. "It means the argument wasn't just an argument. It was the end of something. And I didn't know." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something? Within reason. The argument." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "What was it about?" He looked at the mountains. "Money," he said. "A decision I'd made without telling her. I'd agreed to take a contract working another man's cattle for the winter season, good money, but I'd be away from the ranch for 3 months. She thought I should have asked her. I thought she didn't understand the financial necessity." A pause. "I left to cool down. I was going to come back in an hour and we were going to talk it through properly." He set his cup down. "She went out to the pond." The silence stretched. "She couldn't swim," he said. "I knew that. I'd always known that. She loved the pond, would sit at the edge of it for hours, and I'd always told myself it was fine, that she was sensible, that people didn't just fall in." He looked at his hands. "She fell in. Eli, the accident is the accident," he said, cutting off whatever she was going to say. "I've accepted what I can accept about it. What I haven't..." He stopped. Tried again. "The document means she'd already decided. Before the argument, before that day, she'd already decided. And I hadn't even noticed that she was deciding." Nora was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Damon always said that I never told him what I was feeling, that I communicated badly, that if I'd been clearer he would have understood sooner." She looked at her cup. "And there's probably some truth in that. I did learn to go quiet. When things were difficult, I learned to manage myself rather than speak up, because speaking up usually made things worse." She looked at him. "But the reason I stopped speaking up is that he wasn't hearing me. You can't communicate clearly to someone who isn't actually listening. You just learn to be quiet." Eli looked at her. "Margaret might not have told you," Nora said carefully, "because she'd learned it wasn't safe to tell you. Not dangerous, I don't mean that. But maybe she'd learned over years that telling you certain things didn't change anything. So she stopped. A pause. That's not her fault. And it's not entirely yours. It's what happens in a marriage that stops listening. He sat with that for a long time. I don't know if that's true, he said finally. Neither do I, she said. I didn't know her. I'm just telling you what it can look like from inside. They sat with the mountains and the blue morning sky, and the coffee cooling in their cups, and eventually they got up and went back to work. Ruth came a third time without bread or agenda on a gray afternoon when the wind had a new quality to it. Not cold exactly, but carrying the suggestion of cold, the way a hand on your shoulder carries the suggestion of weight before it actually presses. She came and found Nora alone. Eli was out checking the north pasture and sat down at the kitchen table and folded her hands and said, I need to tell you something about this house. Nora made tea and sat across from her. I was Margaret's closest friend, Ruth said, for almost 15 years from when she and Eli first moved here. I knew this house in her time, and I've watched it in the time after, and I need you to know something that Eli hasn't told you, and probably won't tell you, because it concerns his private understanding of himself, and he's a man who keeps that locked away. Nora waited. The day Margaret died, Ruth said, Eli wasn't just out checking cattle. He'd left in anger. They'd argued about money, about his choices, about the way he made decisions without her, and he'd walked out, rather than stay, and work through it. She looked at Nora steadily. He's carried that since. The belief that if he'd stayed, if he'd chosen her over his temper, she'd still be alive. That her death was in some partial and terrible way, something he caused. He told me some of it, Nora said. Ruth looked mildly surprised. Did he? Not all, but enough. Then you know the shape of it. Ruth turned her teacup. What he doesn't know, what I've never told him, because he's never been ready to hear it, is that I spoke to Margaret 2 weeks before she died. And she told me about the petition she'd filed. She paused. She also told me that she wasn't certain, that she'd filed it because she needed to do something, needed the act of it, to force a response in herself, to clarify whether leaving was what she actually wanted. She said the act of filing had surprised her by making her feel grief rather than relief. Ruth looked at the window. She was going to tell Eli. She was trying to find the right time. The argument may have been her attempt to bring things to a head so they could finally talk about the real thing, about whether they still had a marriage worth keeping. Nora was very still. She didn't leave that day because she'd made a decision, Ruth said quietly. She left to the pond because she was thinking, because she needed to think, because that's what she did when she needed to think. A long pause. The pond was familiar ground, safe ground. It had been safe 1,000 times. She looked at Nora. It was an accident. A terrible, genuine accident. Not a result of the argument, not a consequence of her unhappiness, not Eli's fault in any causal sense. She folded her hands again. But Eli doesn't know she was uncertain. He only knows she filed. And without knowing she was uncertain, the document looks like a verdict. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the wind moving around the house. Why are you telling me this? Nora asked. Ruth looked at her with eyes that were tired and clear. Because you're here, she said simply, and because he's going to tell you about it, maybe not today, maybe not for weeks, but he's moving toward it, I can see it. And when he does, you need to understand what you're holding. She stood. He's a good man who's been punishing himself for something that isn't quite what he thinks it is. He needs someone who can hear the whole story, not just the part he knows. She looked at Nora steadily. I think you might be that person, but you can't be it without the full picture. She left. Nora sat at the table for a long time in the gray afternoon light, holding the full picture Ruth had handed her, feeling its weight, understanding what it meant to be trusted with something this heavy about someone else's life. The storm came in the third week of October. It gave warning the way the worst ones did not, the sudden flare of a summer thunderstorm, but the slow, oppressive build of a system that had been gathering for days. The sky turned yellow-green in the late afternoon. The air went thick and still, in the way that meant not peace, but the absence of wind. Before wind arrived at full strength, the cattle were restless. The horses wouldn't settle. "Tornado weather," Eli said, coming in from the barn, with the last of the animals secured. He looked at the western sky through the kitchen window and didn't like what he saw. "We need to get to the cellar." Nora was at the stove. She turned. Her face was composed, but something behind her eyes had shifted, gone taut. "I can't," she said. He looked at her. "Small spaces," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled. I have difficulty with small spaces. Enclosed spaces." She stopped. "Is there another option?" "No." And he said it not unkindly, but without room for negotiation, because there wasn't room. Through the window, the sky was deepening the color of old bruises. "Nora, we need to go now." She put down the spoon. He watched her take a breath, the deliberate kind, the kind that meant she was managing something real and serious. "I'll be right beside you," he said, the whole time. She nodded once tightly and followed him to the kitchen floor where the cellar door was set into the boards. He lit the lamp, lifted the door, climbed down, first turned, and reached up. She descended slowly, one rung at a time, her grip on the ladder so tight her knuckles were pale. When her feet touched the floor, she pressed immediately into the far corner, arms across her chest, breathing in short, controlled bursts. He pulled the door shut above them. The darkness outside the lamp's radius pressed in from all sides. She was shaking, trying not to, but shaking anyway, the fine tremor of someone fighting their own body's responses. Then the sound came. He'd heard it before. Everyone who'd lived this country long enough had, but it never stopped being exactly what it was. The sound of the world being remade against its will. A freight train running through air rather than rails, the volume building until it stopped being something you heard and became something you felt in the bones of your chest. The cellar shook. Dirt fell from the ceiling in fine curtains. Nora made a sound he hadn't heard from her before, not a scream, just a thin, exhaled note, the sound of control slipping. "Look at me," he said. She turned her head toward him. "Tell me what you can see," he said. "Right now. What's in this cellar?" "What?" "Describe it to me." A pause. She looked around, something in her eyes fighting back toward focus. The lamp. The shelves, preserves mostly, and a few cans. The walls. You. Her breathing slowed fractionally. The floor is dirt. Packed dirt. Good. What can you feel? The wall. It's cold. Rough. A breath. Your hand. You're holding my hand. He was. He didn't remember taking it, but he was holding her hand, and she was gripping back with the same pressure she'd gripped the fence wire, the force of someone who needed something solid. The roar above them peaked, a sound beyond sound, and the whole structure shuddered in a way that felt final. Then it began, very gradually, to ease. In the dark, in the cellar, in the space of the next 20 minutes, Eli said things he hadn't said to anyone. Not planned, not chosen. They came out of the particular conditions of the moment, the dark, and the noise, and the hand gripping his, and the knowledge that they might be about to die, which had a way of removing the usual filters. He told her about the argument. The real version, not the edited one he'd told on the porch, not the version where he was merely absent. The version where he'd raised his voice, where he'd said things he didn't mean about her understanding, and her expectations, and her inability to trust his judgment. Where he'd slammed the door hard enough that the frame cracked. Where he'd walked out not because he needed to cool down, but because leaving felt in that moment like winning. He told her about finding Ruth's face at the edge of the north field, and knowing before she spoke. He told her about the drawer, the divorce papers, the smell of lavender. He talked until the noise above them subsided, and when it was quiet enough to hear himself think, he stopped, and the silence in the cellar was complete. Nora was no longer shaking. She was very still, her hand still in his, her back against the corner wall, watching him with the gray eyes in the lamplight. "You didn't kill her," she said. "You were a man having an argument with his wife. That's not killing someone." "I know that," he said. "Do you?" He didn't answer. She turned so she was facing him more fully still, not letting go of his hand. "I left Damon in the middle of the night," she said. "I'd packed a bag 2 weeks before and hidden it under the floor of the shed. I'd arranged a horse. I'd planned it like an escape, which it was." She looked at the lamplight. "I spent 3 years trying to find a better way. A slower way. A way where I could leave and he'd understand and accept it, and we'd both be okay. There wasn't a way like that. Sometimes there isn't." She looked back at him. "Your wife was trying to find a way. She may have found it eventually if she'd had more time. The time ran out." "The letter means she was trying," Nora said. "Not that she'd decided. There's a difference." He looked at her. "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. "Ruth told me," she said, "about talking to Margaret, about what she said." She watched his face. "I'm sorry. I should have told you as soon as Ruth told me. I've been trying to figure out how." The lamp flickered. The cellar was very quiet. "She wasn't certain," Eli said. It wasn't quite a question. Ruth said she wasn't certain. He sat with that, with the particular weight of information that doesn't change what happened, but changes what it meant. He felt something move in his chest, not dissolving exactly, but loosening. The specific tight knot that had been there for 4 years, the version of events where he had definitively failed her, giving way slightly to something more complicated, and therefore paradoxically more bearable. "Thank you," he said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Above them, the rain began steady, heavy riot. They sat in the cellar and listened to it, and didn't let go. When they emerged, the damage was what it was. The barn roof was gone. The chicken coop was splinters. The north fence, which they'd spent 2 weeks repairing, was flattened for 100 yards. The old oak tree near the porch was down roots, and all lying across the yard, like something ancient and defeated. Eli walked through it with Nora beside him, not speaking, taking inventory with the specific numbness that comes when the damage is large enough that your mind processes it as information rather than loss. They'd built it. They'd rebuild it. That was the shape of things. Nora stopped at the garden. It was wrecked, the plants shredded the stakes, snapped, the soil turned, and buried under debris. 3 weeks of work gone. She stood at the edge of it for a long moment, and Eli thought she was going to cry. She knelt down instead, dug her hands into the mud, pushed aside a broken plank, and came up holding a tomato plant, battered half its leaves, stripped still with one small green fruit, attached its roots, clutching a clump of wet earth. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "We're replanting this," she said. "Now." "Nora, it's pouring, now." She looked at him with those gray eyes steady as stone. "If we wait more, we'll die. If we wait, we give up." She stood cradling the plant. "I'm not giving up. Not on this garden, not on this ranch, and not on us." The last words fell into the rain, and the wreckage and the space between them and Eli looked at her muddy and soaked and holding a battered tomato plant like it was the most important thing in the world, and said, "All right, let's replant it." They worked in the rain until they'd salvaged what they could. 4 plants, a handful of beans still on their trellis, not much, but something. When they came inside, their boots left mud across the kitchen floor, and neither of them cared. He built a fire. She changed and came back wrapped in a blanket he'd warmed by the hearth. He heated water on the surviving stove and made coffee, and they sat by the fire, making plans. What could be rebuilt first, what would wait, what they'd need from town, who they might ask for help. The neighbors, Nora said. We should ask. After what's in the letter. He stopped. She looked at him. What letter? He'd forgotten she didn't know about Damon's plan yet. He hadn't told her. He hadn't worked out how. Nothing, he said. I'll explain later. She accepted that without pressing. They planned until the fire burned low and the coffee was gone, and when they finally said goodnight, it was with the particular closeness of people who have been through something together and come out of it, still standing. He climbed the stairs. He lay down. He thought about the cellar and the things that had been said in it, and about the tomato plant in the mud, and about the word us that she'd said, without appearing to notice she'd said it. He stared at the stars through the gap in the damaged roof above him. Something in his chest had changed. The tightness that had been there so long, he'd stopped registering it as anything other than his normal state. It was different. Not gone, but different. He thought about that. He slept. End of part 2. Approximately 7,200 words. Hugh Aldridge, a narrow man with a narrow face who'd moved into the valley 2 years ago and never quite fit himself to the rhythms of it, had said not hostilely, but in the tone of a man raising what he considered a legitimate concern, that he'd heard some things about the woman Eli had taken on, and he wasn't sure it was right to be associating his family with a ranch that was under that kind of cloud. Eli had said very quietly that he appreciated Hugh's candor and that he hoped things would go well for the Aldridge family in the coming winter, and he'd ridden away. 6 families came. They arrived in the gray early morning, with wagons loaded with lumber and tools, and covered dishes of food, the covered dishes being the women's particular genius, the understanding that people who were going to work hard all day needed to eat well, and that feeding people was itself a form of standing beside them. Ruth came. The Morrisons came. Tom and his 3 sons and his wife Sarah. The Hendersons came, and the Crawfords and old Henry Bauer, who was 70 and couldn't swing a hammer anymore, but could direct the work with an authority born of 50 years of building things in this country. Nora was on the porch when they arrived. Eli watched her face as the wagons came up the road one after another, the way her expression moved from surprise to something more complicated, something that had gratitude in it, but also a particular vulnerability, the face of a person who'd learned not to expect good things from groups of people and was being caught off guard by the evidence. Tom Morrison climbed down and walked to the porch and looked at Nora with the direct assessing gaze he brought to everything. "You're the woman from back east," he said. "I am," Nora said. "Nora Calloway, Eli's housekeeper." Tom nodded. "Tom Morrison, Eli's neighbor for 11 years. He's a good man." He glanced at Eli, then back at Nora. "Anyone he stands by, I stand by. That's how it works out here." He extended his hand. "Welcome to the valley." She shook it. She didn't say much, but her shoulders did something settled or released some held thing, letting go, and she turned and went back into the house to organize the food, and the work began. They worked the way people work when they've done this before, efficiently, without drama, with the particular competence of people who have spent their lives building and fixing things, and know exactly what each stage requires. The barn roof went up in sections, Tom's oldest son, Jake, directing the crew, with the ease of someone who'd done it a dozen times. The fence crew spread out along the property line, working in pairs. Inside the house, the women assessed the water damage with a practiced eye, and made decisions about what needed to happen first. Nora was everywhere, not frantically with focus. She carried lumber for the barn crew, without being asked, held fence posts while the men drove them, moved between the kitchen and the work site in a constant circuit that meant no one ran out of water, and the food was ready when people needed it. She worked alongside Sarah Morrison for an hour on the damaged west wall of the house, the two women bracing the compromised section, while Henry Bauer told them exactly how to do it from his seat on an overturned crate. By midday, she'd talked to almost everyone. Not performed friendliness, not worked to win anyone over, just been herself direct and competent and unhesitating, and let people form their own conclusions. Clara Crawford found Eli near the fence line in the early afternoon. Clara was 55, formidable in the way of a woman who'd raised 6 children and 2 husbands through hard winters and had opinions about everything, and wasn't shy about sharing them. She'd been watching Nora all morning with an expression Eli couldn't quite read. "I'm going to tell you something," Clara said, falling into step beside him. "People keep saying that to me lately," Eli said. "Good. You need the information." She looked at the fence line. "I heard what that man Calloway was saying about your woman, the husband." Eli stopped. "Where'd you hear that?" "He came through Harder's Cross 2 weeks ago," Clara said. "Minetown 40 miles east. My sister's husband works the assay office. He described her well enough that my sister wrote to me." She looked at Eli steadily. "He's been asking around. Quiet, polite about it, but asking. Saying he's looking for his wife that she left unexpectedly, and he's worried about her." A pause. "He didn't say anything about a divorce filing. He made it sound like a missing woman, a man looking for his missing wife." Eli's jaw tightened. "He knows how to tell a story," Clara said. "He's been getting people's sympathy. People help a worried husband." She watched Eli's face. "I thought you should know the shape of it before he arrives." "You think he's coming here?" "I think he's working his way west," Clara said. "I think a man who's been asking town by town for 2 months doesn't stop asking." She looked toward the house where Nora was visible through the kitchen window. "She's a good woman, steady and honest, and she works without complaint. I've seen enough of both kinds to know." She looked back at Eli. "Whatever she's running from, she deserves the chance to keep running from it until the law gives her something better." She walked away. Eli stood with the fence post in his hands and thought about Damon Calloway working his way west town by town. Quiet and polite and sympathetic, building a story that positioned him as the victim. He thought about what he was going to do about it. He didn't tell Nora that night. The day had been hard and long and productive, and at the end of it, she sat on the porch steps with her boots off and her braid half down, and the particular exhausted happiness of someone who'd been through something and come out the right side. And she watched the last of the wagons disappear down the road and said almost to herself, "I didn't know people did this." "Did what?" Eli sat down beside her. "Just came. Just showed up and worked." She looked at the barn with its new roof, the fence line that now stood straight and strong for as far as she could see. "In the place I came from before Damon, when I was growing up, we had neighbors like this. My father had a barn raising. 40 people came." She turned the memory over. "I'd forgotten that was possible." "It's still possible," Eli said. "You just have to be somewhere people have decided to be that way." She looked at him. "Is that why you stayed after Margaret?" He thought about it. "Partly, and partly because leaving felt like giving up on something, even when I wasn't sure what I was giving up on." She nodded slowly. They sat in the cooling evening air, and the barn threw a long shadow across the yard, and the garden 4 plants and a handful of beans, small victory in a torn-up patch of ground, was visible from where they sat. "Something's coming," Nora said. Not quite a question. He looked at her. She was watching him with those eyes that missed less than most people realized. "Clara Crawford told me something today," he said. "About Damon." She went still. He told her what Clara had said. He watched her face as she processed it. The composure that was always her first response, the effort to keep the surface steady while the depths rearranged. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. He always was good at telling his version, she said finally. Her voice was even, but it cost her. He genuinely believes it, I think. That he's the wronged party. That I left without reason, that he's a worried husband who just wants to bring his wife home. She looked at her hands. He's not lying exactly. He's just living in a story where he's the center and the hero. What do you want to do? I want to stay, she said immediately. I want to finish the divorce through legal channels. And then I want to stay here and not spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. She looked at him. But wanting that and getting it are different things. When the time comes, Eli said, and he arrives because Clara's right. He will arrive. We don't deal with it alone. We go to Sheriff Wade first and document everything. We make sure Wade knows the full picture before Damon gets the chance to present his version. Nora looked at him. Eli, you're not alone in this, he said. Not urgently, not as a declaration, just as a statement of fact, the way he'd say the barn roof was solid or the south fence was fixed. That's not a feeling or a promise. That's just the situation. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. They went inside. She made supper. He helped clear. They said goodnight and went to their separate rooms, and Eli lay in his room and stared at the repaired ceiling and thought about Damon Calloway working his way toward them, quiet and patient, and telling a story, and thought about what it meant to be the person standing between someone and a story that wasn't true. Jonas Pruitt came back on a Sunday. Eli was out on the north pasture. Nora was alone in the house when she heard the knock, not the door. Just a knock on the porch rail, the tentative knock of someone who isn't sure they have the right to knock on the door itself. She found him on the steps. He was worse than the last time, the hat gone entirely. The boots now definitely coming apart at the sole. He on both sides the face of a man who'd made some bad decisions in a short period and was living in the consequences. He looked at her, and something moved in his face. Recognition. You're the woman from back east, he said. I am, Nora said. Eli isn't here. I know. He turned his hat, then seemed to remember he didn't have it. Turned his hands instead. I was hoping I needed to talk to someone. About something. She studied him. He wasn't a threat, she could read that. He was a man in trouble who'd run out of other doors to knock on. Come in, she said. Coffee's still hot. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she poured him, and for a while he just sat there, gathering something. She waited. Eli's a good man, Jonas said finally. I know, Nora said. He hasn't told you. It wasn't a question. Told me what? He looked at the coffee cup. The afternoon his wife died. I was the one who found her. He said it quietly, the way you say something you've been carrying a long time. I was passing through the property on my way to fix the north section. I used to work for him before, and I saw her in the water. He stopped. I got to her. She was already... He stopped again. I brought her out. I went to find Eli. He looked up. He was coming back already. Running. He must have started back before I found her. Nora was very still. He told people he was out checking cattle, Jonas said. That he was far away. That he didn't know until Ruth came to tell him. He turned the cup. That's not the truth. The truth is he was a mile and a half out when he heard me shouting. He got there while I was still trying. He was there for the last part. Nora understood. He saw her. He saw her, Jonas said. And he tried. We both tried. And it was too late. He looked at his hands. He told the story different afterward. Said he was farther away than he was. I think he couldn't. I think he needed to have been farther away. Needed to believe he couldn't have made a difference, even if he'd tried. He swallowed. So he told the story where he wasn't there, and asked me to keep it. The kitchen was very quiet. And you kept it, Nora said. For 4 years, Jonas said. And then I needed money, and I asked him for it, and he said no, and I threatened to talk, and he threw me out. He looked at her. I'm not going to say anything. I was never really going to. I was scared and hungry, and I said something stupid. He looked down. But I've been thinking. Carrying this version alone, it's heavy. And I think maybe he's been carrying it alone, too. And maybe that's not helping either of you. Tell me the rest, Nora said. All of it. He did. The full account took 20 minutes. When he was done, Nora poured him more coffee and sat with what she'd been given. Not just the fact of Eli's presence, the fact that he'd tried, that he'd run back before he had any reason to run back, as if something in him had known, that he'd tried and failed, and then built a story that made the failing even worse than it was, because the version where he'd been too far away to help was easier to live with than the version where he'd been close enough to try and it still hadn't been enough. Why are you telling me this? She asked. The same question she'd asked Ruth. Because I think it's time he knows someone else knows, Jonas said. Not to punish him, not to expose him. Just because... He stopped. Because the true story is actually less terrible than the one he's been living with. And he deserves to know that. She looked at him steadily. Are you going to tell him? I think that should be you, Jonas said. He met her eyes. I think he can hear it from you. He left the coffee half-finished and walked back out into the afternoon. Nora sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. Eli came back from the pasture as the sun was getting low. He came in through the kitchen door and found Nora at the table, not cooking, not mending, just sitting with her hands folded, and the expression of someone who has decided what they're going to say and is waiting for the right moment. He stopped. Jonas came, she said. He went very still. Sit down, she said. Please. He sat. She told him. Carefully, completely, without softening it or adding anything, just the account, as Jonas had given it the full shape of what had happened, and the full shape of what Eli had been carrying in its place. He didn't speak during it. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and his face doing nothing visible, the complete stillness of a man applying everything he has to the task of holding still. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I didn't know if she was already gone when I got there, he said finally. His voice was very low. I didn't know if the time it took me to run back, if those minutes were the ones that mattered. He looked at his hands. So I told myself I hadn't been there, that I couldn't have known, that I'd been too far away to do anything. He swallowed. Because if I'd been there, and I'd tried, and it still wasn't enough. That's the true story, Nora said, gently. He looked at her. You tried, she said. You were there. You ran back because something in you knew. You tried, and it wasn't enough, and that's terrible, but it's the truth. The truth isn't that you were far away and didn't know. She held his gaze. The truth is that you were there, and you tried, and some things can't be fixed even when you try. Something moved across his face, a long, deep thing, like a crack traveling through stone. He bent forward, elbows on the table, hands over his face. He didn't make a sound, but his shoulders shook. She didn't say anything. She didn't try to stop it, or fix it, or move it along. She just sat across from him at the kitchen table and let him be in it the way you let someone be in rain, not because you're indifferent, but because you understand that some weather has to fall. When it passed, he straightened. His face was wet. He didn't try to hide it. I've been carrying the wrong story, he said. Yes, she said. The true one is, he searched for the word. It's still terrible. It is, she agreed. But you can carry it differently. You can put down the part that wasn't true. He looked at her for a long moment. Why does it matter to you, he said, how I carry it? She looked at him steadily. "Because you matter to me," she said, "and I'm tired of watching you punish yourself with a story that isn't right." And the kitchen held the last of the afternoon light gold and slanting, and outside the repaired barn cast its new shadow across the yard, and the garden was small and muddy and alive. And Eli Harrow looked at Nora Calloway across the table where they'd eaten 100 meals in the past 2 months, and understood something that he suspected he'd been moving toward since the first night he'd walked in to find her at his stove. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The rules I set when you got here," he said. "The professional arrangement. The boundaries. Yes. I'd like to renegotiate them." She was very still. "Not immediately," he said. "Not tonight. There's too much in the air tonight, and I don't want to say something in the middle of all of this that sounds like the moment talking rather than me." He looked at her. "But I want you to know that I'm renegotiating them. In my head. And when things are clearer, when whatever's coming with Damon has come and gone, and we're on the other side of it, I'd like to say the things I'm not saying tonight." Nora's eyes were very bright. "All right," she said softly. "All right," he said. They made supper together without discussion, moving around the kitchen, with the ease of long habit, and they ate and cleaned up and said good night, and the house held them both in its repaired and imperfect shelter, and the night was clear. Damon Calloway arrived on a Wednesday morning 11 days later. Eli was in the barn when he heard a single horse moving at a walk, the measured pace of someone who wasn't in a hurry, because they knew where they were going. He came out into the yard and watched the rider come up the road and through the open gate and stop in the yard, and took in the fact that Damon Calloway was not what he'd been expecting. He'd been expecting someone like Hastings in Nora's original telling theatrical aggressive arriving with resources on display. Damon was the opposite. He was a condiment man, 40 or so, wearing good clothes, but not ostentatiously so, with a face that was handsome, in a way that had some weather in it, some history. He dismounted without drama, and tied his horse to the rail, and looked at Eli with the eyes of a man who had been very carefully managing himself for a long time. "Mr. Harrow," he said, not a question. "Mr. Calloway," Eli said, a slight pause. "She told you about me." "She did." Damon looked around the property at the new barn roof, the repaired fences, the house with its mended west wall, and its swept porch, and the clay pot by the door, where something was still growing. He took it in with an expression that Eli couldn't immediately categorize. "Is she here?" he asked. "She is." "Will she see me?" Eli considered the question. "That's her choice to make." He went inside. Nora was at the kitchen table. She'd heard the horse, too. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the controlled stillness. She looked at him when he came in. "It's him," she said. "Yes." She sat for a moment. Then she stood. "I'll go out." "You don't have to." "I know." She untied her apron, set it over the chair. "But I'd rather face it than wait in here." He went out with her. Damon was standing in the yard where Eli had left him. When he saw Nora, he went very still, the stillness of someone absorbing something that is both expected and not. "Nora," he said. "Damon," she said. They looked at each other across the yard. Eli stayed at the porch, giving them space, but not leaving. "You look well," Damon said. His voice was careful, precise, the voice of a man, choosing every word. "I am well," Nora said. "I've been looking for you for 3 months." "I know, I've heard. I want you to come home." And he said it simply, without the dramatic urgency Eli had expected. Just said it the way you state a preference. "I know you filed. I know what the filing means. But I want you to come home first and talk to me before the court makes a decision. I want to explain some things." "There's nothing to explain, Damon." "There is." His jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in the composure. "I've had time to think. 3 months looking for you, I've had a lot of time to think. I know I—" He stopped, started again. "I know I wasn't easy to be with. I know I held things too tight. I know I made decisions for you that you should have made yourself." He looked at her steadily. "I can learn differently. I'm telling you I want to try." "I know you believe that," Nora said. Her voice was gentle, but very steady. "I know you mean it right now. But Damon, I said those same words to myself for 3 years. Every time I thought about leaving, I thought he means, well, he can change. I should give it more time." She looked at him. At some point, meaning well and actually being different have to become the same thing. They never did. "You didn't give me a chance." "I gave you 3 years of chances," she said. "I gave you everything I had. And at the end of it, I was someone I didn't recognize. Someone who made herself small and quiet and careful all the time, who stopped having opinions about her own life, who planned her escape like a prisoner." Her voice remained level. "I don't blame you for all of that. I had my part in it. But I can't go back to being that person. I won't." Damon was quiet for a long moment. Something moved in his face, the composure working hard. "Is it him?" He looked at Eli briefly, then back to Nora. "It's me," Nora said. "It's always been me. I need to be somewhere I can breathe." Ruth Henley's buggy came up the road. This surprised no one more than Ruth herself. Eli suspected she pulled up at the gate and climbed down with the ease of someone who'd decided en route that she had business here, and walked into the yard and looked at Damon Calloway with eyes that had seen a great deal. "You'll be the husband," Ruth said. "I will," Damon said, with the slight wary look of a man who doesn't know what kind of interference is about to occur. "Come sit with me," Ruth said, and gestured toward the porch steps. He looked at her. He looked at Nora. Something in him, the controlled, managed surface of him, faltered slightly at the directness of Ruth's invitation. He went and sat with her. Eli moved to stand beside Nora. They watched Ruth and Damon on the steps, watched Ruth lean forward and begin speaking quietly, watched Damon's body language move through several stages, defensive, then uncertain, then something that looked like the beginning of a different state entirely. "What's she telling him?" Nora asked quietly. "I don't know," Eli said. "Whatever he needs to hear, I think." What Ruth was saying, what Eli would piece together later from what she told him, was something about her own marriage, about a man she'd loved for 30 years who had held too tight in a different way, about the long education of living alongside someone who has to control things because they're afraid, and the longer education of learning to forgive that without accepting it. About the difference between understanding why someone is the way they are and being required to stay in the damage of it. She talked for 20 minutes. Damon listened. At the end of it, Damon looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up at Nora across the yard. "I won't stop the divorce," he said. His voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the precise management. "I'll sign whatever the court needs from me." He looked at his hands again. "I want you to know that I don't think I ever—" He stopped. "I love you. I loved you wrong. I don't know if I know how to do it differently yet, but I'll stop making you prove that you have the right to your own life." Nora looked at him for a long time. "Thank you," she said. He stood. He shook hands with Eli, a brief, formal handshake, the handshake of two men who understand each other's position without liking it. He said something to Ruth in a low voice that made the old woman nod. He untied his horse, mounted, and rode back down the road. They watched until the dust settled. Ruth came to stand beside them. "He'll be all right," she said, with the confidence of someone who has assessed a great many people. "He needs time, and he needs someone honest to talk to." He has a mother who's sharp and a pastor who's kind, and that's enough to work with." "You have a lot of faith in people," Nora said. "I have enough," Ruth said, which was different. She looked at both of them with the expression Eli had learned meant she was about to say something real. "You two are going to stop being so careful with each other now," she said. "Don't argue with me about it. Just do it." She picked up her basket from where she'd set it at the gate. "There's bread in here. Eat it while it's warm." She got back in her buggy and drove away. Sheriff Wade came the following week, not because Eli had called him, but because he'd heard about Damon's visit through the particular channels by which everything in a small county eventually became known, and he wanted to ensure the situation was documented. He was a lean, deliberate man who listened twice as much as he talked, and he listened to Eli's account, and then Nora's account, with the same careful attention, made notes, and confirmed that the divorce filing was moving through the court, that Damon had signed a non-contestation agreement, and that as far as the law was concerned, Nora Calloway was a free woman in every meaningful sense. "Should be finalized within 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe less. The judge in this district doesn't like cases to drag." "Thank you, Sheriff," Nora said. He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said. "I knew Margaret Harrow. She used to come into town when Eli was out on the range, have coffee at the Crawford place, pick up supplies." He looked at Eli. "She talked about this ranch like she loved it, like she was still deciding what she wanted, but that the ranch itself was never in question." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked out. The door closed behind him. Eli stood in the kitchen, where he'd stood 100 times, with the afternoon light coming through the window, at the angle that meant it was past 3 o'clock, and the smell of coffee still in the air, and the sound of the barn, and the yard, and the small world of the property going on around them. He looked at Nora. "The rules," he said. She looked at him, waiting. "I said I'd renegotiate them when things were clearer," he said. "Things are clearer." He crossed the kitchen to where she was standing at the window. "I want to say the things I didn't say that night." "Then say them," she said, quiet and certain. "You came here with 37 cents in your pocket," he said, "and 2 days head start on whatever was following you, and you swept my porch and planted something in a pot and cooked a hot meal, and you've been carrying this household and this ranch, and in your quieter way, you've been carrying me for 3 months. He stopped, found the words. "I was a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to want tomorrow to arrive. You reminded me." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you already are. I'm not asking you to make promises about what comes next. But I want to be honest with you, in the way I haven't been honest, because the rules I set stopped me, and the honest thing is I love you. I've been in the process of loving you since you told me you'd stay, because the alternative was giving up, and you weren't giving up." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I love you," she said. "I've known it for a while. I was afraid of it because the last time I loved someone, it became the reason I couldn't leave." She met his eyes. "You've made it the reason I want to stay. That's different." He crossed the distance between them and kissed her, and it was nothing like the careful, tentative first kisses of people who aren't sure of the ground. It was certain the kiss of 2 people who have been through enough together that the uncertainty is about the future, not the present, and who have decided that the future is worth moving toward. When they pulled apart, Nora was almost smiling, not almost smiling, the real version. "The 6 months are almost up," she said. "I know." "Are we reassessing?" "Yes," he said. "The assessment is stay, not as an employee, not as a housekeeper, as—" he stopped. "Whatever we're building, as the person who's building it with me." "That's going to need a better name eventually," she said. "It will," he agreed. "We have time to find it." The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in late November, 43 days after Sheriff Wade's visit. The letter came with the Morning Post, and Nora opened it at the kitchen table with Eli across from her, and read it through twice and set it down. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She folded it and set it beside her coffee cup and looked out the window at the yard where the first real snow had settled overnight. Not the heavy, serious snow that was coming, just the announcement of it, an inch or two of white that covered the repaired fences and the garden dormant now saved for spring, and the new barn roof, and the old familiar shapes of the property. "I should go into town," she said. "Tell Sheriff Wade. Make sure it's registered properly." "This afternoon," he said. "Ruth is coming this morning. She wants to show you how to put up the root cellar before the hard freeze." Nora looked at him. "She's going to give me opinions about my method of storing carrots." "Almost certainly. And I'm going to listen to all of them." "That's the correct response." She smiled, got up to pour more coffee, set his cup down in front of him without being asked, still warm, still right. They went into town in the early afternoon, the wagon moving through the fresh snow with a sound like quiet. The mountains to the west were white from peak to timberline, the sky above them, that particular shade of winter blue that seemed to go on forever. Sheriff Wade registered the document. Mrs. Henderson at the county clerk's office shook Nora's hand and said with the warmth of someone who'd been quietly following the story, "Congratulations, Miss Calloway." "Thank you," Nora said. "Mrs.?" The clerk paused. "Well, what should I call you?" Nora looked at Eli. He looked at her. "We haven't sorted that yet," Eli said. "Harrow," Nora said. She said it simply the way she'd said, "Stay not with performance, just with certainty." "You can call me Nora Harrow." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. Eli's eyebrows rose. "We haven't," he started. "I know," Nora said, looking at him with those gray eyes, steady and clear. "But if you're going to ask me, you were going to ask me anyway. I'd rather we both just knew it." She held his gaze. "If that's what you were going to ask." "That's what I was going to ask," he said. "Then I've already answered." Mrs. Henderson looked between them with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something she'll be telling people about. For years. She wrote Nora Harrow in the margin of the document in pencil and said she'd update the official records when there was a certificate to file. They drove home in the same snow quiet, the mountains still showing in the west, the valley below them white and clean. "You could have let me ask properly," Eli said. "You were going to take another month," Nora said. He thought about it. "Probably," he admitted. She looked at the mountains. "I've been cautious long enough." They were married in December at the Morrison place with Ruth and Tom and Sarah and 6 other neighbors in attendance, the house full of the smell of spruce and beeswax candles and the particular warmth of a room with too many people in it, being happy all at once. Judge Morrison's brother performed the ceremony the same words that had been said 1,000 times in 1,000 kitchens and parlors in this country, simple and good. "Do you take this woman, I do. Do you take this man, I do." The room made the sounds. Rooms make at those moments. Ruth cried quietly, in the way of a woman who has earned her tears. Tom Morrison shook Eli's hand with both of his, and then shook Nora's, and said welcome to the valley for the second time, meaning it differently now. Sarah Morrison had made a cake 3 layers with dried fruit in it, because fresh fruit was a summer proposition, and they were well into winter, and it was the best cake Nora had ever tasted, and she said so, and Sarah looked pleased in the specific way of someone who has waited a long time to make a cake for this occasion. They drove home through the dark and the snow. The house was cold, they'd been gone all day, and Eli built the fire while Nora lit the lamps, and the warmth came up slowly, the way it did in old houses from the center outward, and by the time they'd had the last of the food, Sarah had packed for them to take home. The kitchen felt like itself again. Eli went upstairs first to open the window and let some air inhabit even in December, and came back down to find Nora standing in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on, looking at the room. He stopped beside her. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The table," she said. He looked. The table where they'd eaten every meal for 3 months, where they'd planned the repairs and played cards and had the conversations that had changed the shape of both of them. Set for 2, as she'd set it from the first night, with the same quiet intention. "I remember walking in here the first time," she said. "I'd been alone in this house for 2 days, and I didn't know if you'd come back, or what you'd be like when you did, or whether any of this was going to work." She looked at the table. "I set 2 plates because I needed to believe it was going to be that kind of house. A house where 2 people sat down together. It is that kind of house," he said. "It is now." She agreed. She took his hand. "Let's stay in it." Spring came, as it always did, sudden and determined. The garden was the first proof of it, the ground softening the seeds Nora had saved through the winter. Going into the earth in rows, she laid out with the focused attention she brought to any problem that required both care and patience. The tomato plant, the one that had survived the tornado that had produced its small fruit through the fall and been brought inside before the first hard freeze, and tended all winter in the south window, was the first to go back into the ground in April, replanted with ceremony and mud on both their hands. Eli watched her set it in the earth, press the soil around the roots, sit back on her heels, and look at it. "You think it'll take?" he asked. "It already took," she said, looking at the plant. "It survived a tornado and a Montana winter. It knows what it's doing." He crouched beside her. They looked at the plant together, small and green and unconcerned, doing what it had been doing all along, which was growing. "Tell me something," Nora said. "What?" "When you came home that first night. When you walked in and found me at your stove." She looked at him. "What were you actually thinking?" He considered. "I was thinking I'd finally lost my mind," he said. "And then I was thinking the beans smelled very good." She laughed. The real laugh, the one that had surprised him the first time he'd heard it, that still surprised him sometimes with how complete it was. "And after that I was thinking that whoever you were, you'd swept the porch and planted something in a pot and cooked a hot meal, and whoever does those things—" He stopped, found the right words. "Whoever does those things isn't someone who's given up. And I'd been looking at a lot of people who'd given up." He met her eyes. "Including myself." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "I hadn't given up," she said. "I was terrified. I was down to 37 cents and the end of my rope, and I was terrified." And she looked at the garden, the rows of turned earth, the small green plant in its place. "But I'd decided to try." "That's enough," Eli said. "It's enough," she agreed. They stayed in the garden until the afternoon light shifted, and when they went back inside the house, held its warmth the way it had learned to, from the center outward from the fire they kept lit, and the food on the stove, and the 2 people moving through its rooms with the ease of people who had chosen each other and kept choosing daily in the small acts of a shared life. On the mantelpiece beside the clock and the candle stub and the river stone, Nora had found on the way home from the Morrison place, and kept for no reason other than it was smooth and fit well in the hand, there was a photograph. Not a wedding photograph, they hadn't thought to arrange one, but a photograph Tom Morrison's oldest boy, Jake, had taken with his box camera on the day the neighbors came to rebuild Eli and Nora standing side by side in front of the new barn roof. Both of them dirty and tired and squinting slightly into the autumn sun. Not looking at the camera, but at something to the left of it, something that had made Nora smile, and Eli's expression go quiet and attentive in the way it did when he was looking at something he wanted to remember. Nora had framed it with a piece of window trim left over from the repairs. Eli had noticed it on the mantelpiece and not mentioned it, which was its own kind of answer. 2 plates on the table, 2 cups by the coffee pot, 2 lives folded together like paper along a crease, the crease itself invisible, now the shape simply the shape of the thing. The house was not a tomb. It had not been for some time. It was a home. It knew the difference.